Alright, let's go. Number 10. The temple that should not exist. On a dry hilltop in southern Turkey, there is a place called Göbekli Tepe. It is a ring of massive stone pillars, some of them 16 feet tall and weighing as much as 10 tons, carved with foxes, scorpions, vultures, and snakes. There is nothing strange about ancient people building with stone. What is strange is the date. Göbekli Tepe is 11,600 years old. It is older than writing. It is older than the wheel. It is older than pottery, older than metal, and older than the first cities by thousands of years. It was built before farming. And that single fact breaks the story we told ourselves for 100 years. We always believed it happened in one order. First, humans learned to farm. Farming gave them surplus food. Surplus food let them settle into villages. Villages grew rich enough to build temples and gods and monuments. Civilization, we said, was the child of agriculture. But Göbekli Tepe was raised by hunter-gatherers. People with no farms, no metal tools, no draft animals, no permanent towns. Somehow quarried, carved, and raised these giant pillars, and arranged them into rings that align with the heavens. Worse, after using the site for centuries, they deliberately buried the whole thing under tons of rubble, on purpose, for reasons no one can explain. So the haunting question is this. What could possibly inspire scattered bands of foragers to come together, by the hundreds, and move 10-ton stones, with no king to command them, and no city to house them? Some researchers now suspect the old order was backwards, that it was not farming that gave birth to religion and monuments. It may have been the desire to gather and worship at places like this that first forced humans to settle down, and to invent farming just to feed the crowds. Think about what that actually required. These were people who, the day before they started, had no village to return to at night, no granary, no system of writing to record a plan, no chief with the power to command an army of laborers. They lived in small mobile bands, hunting gazelle, and gathering wild grains. And yet, somewhere in their world there was an idea so powerful that it could pull hundreds of these scattered people to one hilltop, and bind them to a project that would take years, even lifetimes, to complete. Someone had to feed all those workers. Someone had to coordinate the quarrying, the carving, the dragging of stones across the landscape with nothing but ropes, levers, and muscle. The level of cooperation on display at Göbekli Tepe is staggering for people we long dismissed as simple cavemen, and the carvings themselves deepen the puzzle. The animals chosen are not the gentle prey these people ate. They are dangerous things, predators and scavengers, snakes and vultures and wild boar, rendered with real skill and clearly chosen on purpose. This was not decoration. It was meaning, a story or a belief system carved in stone, by a people who left us the message but not the language to read it. And there is one more detail that sends a chill down the spine of everyone who studies it: the burial. After generations of use, the builders did not simply abandon Göbekli Tepe and walk away. They filled it in. They carefully packed the enormous stone enclosures with rubble, dirt, and debris, by hand, until the entire complex was hidden beneath an artificial hill. This is why it survived so perfectly for 11,000 years. But why would anyone bury the greatest achievement of their world? Were they hiding it, protecting it, or laying it to rest like a body in a grave? Did the beliefs that raised it die, and the people seal it away as something dangerous or sacred or finished? We have monuments from the ancient world that were forgotten, looted, or left to crumble. We have very few that their own makers deliberately entombed. That is true, then everything began here, on this hill, for reasons we still do not understand. Number 9. The signs in the dark. When we think of Ice Age cave art, we picture the animals. The bulls, the horses, the herds of deer, thundering across the stone. But hidden among those famous beasts is something far stranger and far less talked about. Symbols. Across the caves of Ice Age Europe, painted beside the animals, the same small set of geometric marks appears again and again. Dots, lines, crosses, ladders, hands, spirals. Researchers who cataloged them found something astonishing. Across 20,000 years and thousands of miles, prehistoric people used the same 32 signs over and over. These were not random doodles. The same handful of symbols, repeating across an entire continent and across hundreds of generations, suggests something deliberate. A shared code, a system. Some scientists believe these signs may be the faint beginnings of a kind of proto-writing, an attempt to record meaning in symbols tens of thousands of years before the first true writing in Mesopotamia. But here's the mystery. We have no idea what they mean. We can read the hieroglyphs of Egypt and the cuneiform of Sumer. But these older marks, scratched by people who watched mammoths walk the earth, are silent. Were they counting something? Marking the seasons? The moons? The migrations of the herds? Were they sacred symbols or signatures, or the names of the dead? What makes this even more tantalizing is where the signs appear. They are not scattered at random. Certain symbols seem to cluster in certain regions, almost like local dialects of a shared visual language. Some appear right at the entrances of caves, as if marking a threshold, a warning, or a welcome. Others are tucked deep in the most hidden chambers, beside the great paintings, in places a person could only reach by crawling through the dark for hours. Whoever made these marks meant something by their placement. And the sheer span of time involved is almost impossible to grasp. 20,000 years. To put that in perspective, all of recorded history, from the first cities of Sumer to this very moment, fits into about 5,000 years. These signs were used for 4 times longer than that, by people who never built a city, never forged a metal tool, and never, as far as we know, spoke to one another across the continent. And still, the same symbols surface again and again, in France, in Spain, in caves, 1,000 miles apart. It is one of the oldest patterns of human thought we have ever found. And perhaps the most human detail of all is the hands. Among the geometric signs, again and again, people pressed or painted their own hands onto the cave walls, sometimes blowing pigment around them to leave a perfect negative outline. Thousands of years later, you can place your palm against the stone and match it, finger for finger, to the hand of someone who lived in the Ice Age. Some of those hands are small, children's hands. They reached into the deep dark, by the light of a guttering lamp, and said, in the only way they could, I was here. Whatever the 32 signs meant, that impulse behind them is unmistakable and achingly familiar. The need to leave a mark. The need to be remembered. It is the same urge that drives a name carved into a desk, or a message sealed in a bottle, or a video uploaded to the world. We may be staring at humanity's very first attempt to write down a thought, and we cannot understand a single word of it. Number 8. The little statues. They are small enough to hold in one hand, carved from stone, bone, and ivory, and shaped into the form of women. We call them the Venus figurines, and they are one of the great puzzles of the prehistoric world. The oldest are around 40,000 years old, and they have been found scattered across an enormous range, from France all the way to Siberia. What makes them so strange is not that they exist, but that they are so consistent. Across thousands of miles, and across many thousands of years, these figurines share the same strange features. The faces are usually blank or absent. The hands and feet are tiny or missing, but the body is exaggerated, heavy, and unmistakably emphasized. Why would people separated by entire continents, with no possible contact between them, carve the same kind of object in the same strange style for 20,000 years? It is one of the longest-lasting artistic traditions in all of human history, and we do not know what it was for. Were they goddesses, symbols of fertility and survival in a brutal world? Were they good luck charms, carried by people who lived on the knife's edge of starvation? Were they self-portraits, carved by women looking down at their own bodies? Or were they something we have not even thought of, an idea so central to these people that they carried it across the entire Ice Age world, and so alien to us that we cannot even guess at it? Consider the effort poured into them. Some of the finest were carved from mammoth ivory, one of the hardest and most precious materials of the Ice Age, using nothing but stone tools. Carving a single figurine that way could take many days of careful, patient work by firelight in the bitter cold. These were not idle trinkets knocked out in an afternoon. They were valuable, deliberate, and clearly worth an enormous investment of time to people who had very little of it to spare. And they were carried. Many were found far from where their raw material came from, meaning people brought these little statues with them as they moved across the brutal Ice Age landscape, holding on to them through hunger and migration and death. Whatever they meant, they mattered enough to keep. Some show signs of having been handled for generations, worn smooth by countless hands. Picture that. An object passed from parent to child, again and again across centuries, in a world with no writing and no permanent home. The Venus figurines may be among the oldest sacred objects our species ever made. But the belief they served, the thing they pointed to, has dissolved completely into the dark. Were they goddesses, ancestors, prayers, or protection? Or were they something we have not even thought of? And the timing matters enormously. The oldest of these figurines date to right around the moment our ancestors swept into Europe, and the great age of cave art began. In other words, they appear at the exact dawn of what we would recognize as the modern human mind. Whatever was happening in those heads, this hunger to represent the human form, to hold an idea in carved stone, was part of the very first wave of it. That makes the figurines not just art, but a kind of fossil of human thought, evidence of minds that had begun to symbolize, to abstract, to believe. And the fact that the tradition holds together so tightly, across such vast distances and spans of time, hints at something we struggle to accept about these people. That ideas, beliefs, maybe even stories, could travel and persist across the prehistoric world far more powerfully than we ever gave them credit for. The little statues are not telling. Number 7. The ghost species. In a cave in the mountains of Siberia, scientists found a single finger bone and a few teeth. That was almost all there was. But when they extracted the DNA from that tiny fragment, they got the shock of their lives. The bone did not belong to a modern human. It did not belong to a Neanderthal. It belonged to an entirely unknown kind of human, a whole species that no one had ever known existed. We call them the Denisovans. And here is what is so unsettling. We have almost no bones, no skull, no skeleton. We barely know what they looked like. And yet, we know they were real. We know they were a distinct branch of humanity. And we know they were spread across a huge part of Asia, because their DNA is still inside living people today. Hundreds of millions of people, especially across Asia and the Pacific, carry Denisovan genes right now. One of those genes even helps people in Tibet survive the thin air of the high mountains. So we have a species of human that we have, in a sense, met only through their ghost, written into our own blood, and through a handful of teeth. An entire kind of people who lived and loved and raised children for tens of thousands of years, has been almost completely erased from the fossil record. And the deeper scientists look, the stranger the story becomes. The DNA tells us that the Denisovans were not a brief footnote. They thrived for a very long time, and they were not one small group, but a varied population, spread across an immense range, from the freezing mountains of Siberia to the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia. Different living peoples carry slightly different flavors of Denisovan ancestry, which means there were probably several distinct Denisovan groups, meeting and mixing with our ancestors at different times and places. We are not talking about a single chance encounter. We are talking about a sustained, repeated overlap of two kinds of humanity, lasting thousands of years. Our ancestors and theirs met. They lived alongside one another. They had children together, children whose descendants are reading and hearing these words today. And yet, for all of that, the physical remains add up to little more than a few teeth, a finger bone, a fragment of jaw, and a piece of skull. An entire chapter of the human story, an entire kind of person, has been almost erased from the earth, surviving mostly as whispers in our own genome. And the Denisovans left one more gift, or perhaps one more warning, written into the people of today. High on the Tibetan plateau, where the air holds so little oxygen that most lowlanders grow sick just visiting, the local people thrive. They farm, raise families, and live their whole lives at altitudes that would slowly kill the rest of us. The reason, scientists discovered, is a special version of a gene that helps their bodies cope with the thin air, and that gene did not come from our own line. It came from the Denisovans. A vanished species, gone for tens of thousands of years, is still quietly helping living human beings survive one of the harshest environments on the planet. Think about that. The dead are not only buried in the ground. Sometimes they are buried in us, in our cells, keeping us alive in ways we never knew, until a scientist reads the code and finds a stranger's signature inside. How many more lost branches of humanity are out there, waiting in some cave, known only by the DNA they left inside us? Number 6. The Hobbits of Flores. On the remote Indonesian island of Flores, scientists uncovered something that, by all the rules we thought we knew, should have been impossible. The bones of a tiny human, fully grown adults who stood only about 3.5 feet tall, with brains roughly a third the size of ours. They lived as recently as 50,000 years ago, which means they shared this planet with modern humans like us. Scientists nicknamed them the Hobbits, and formally named them Homo floresiensis, and they have caused arguments ever since. How did they get so small? The leading idea is something called island dwarfism, where large animals trapped on islands with limited food shrink over generations, growing smaller and smaller to survive. It happens to elephants, to deer, to many creatures. But to a human, with those tiny brains, the hobbits still apparently made stone tools and used fire and hunted. And the island holds another mystery. The people who live on Flores today tell old stories of small, hairy, cave-dwelling people who once lived in the forest, who they call the Ibu Gogo. Folklore, surely, a coincidence. And yet, here lie the bones of a tiny, vanished human, on the very island where the legends are told. The discovery tore the scientific world apart, and in some ways, it still has not healed. For years, some researchers refused to believe the hobbits were a real species at all. They argued the little skeletons must be modern humans, suffering from some disease that stunted their growth and shrank their skulls. The debate grew bitter, but more bones emerged, more individuals, all with the same tiny proportions, and on a nearby island, even older miniature human remains turned up as well. It is very hard to explain an entire population of identically tiny people as a string of sick individuals. The likeliest answer remains the most astonishing one, that a kind of human really did shrink, over countless generations, into something like a living myth. And think about what that means for the rest of our family tree. If a branch of humanity could survive, isolated and unnoticed, on one small island until just 50,000 years ago, what else slipped through the gaps? The Indonesian archipelago is made of thousands of islands, most of them never excavated. The hobbits show us that the human story was not a single clean line marching toward us. It was a wild, branching, tangled bush, full of strange and forgotten experiments. And the hobbits raise a question that reaches far beyond one island. If their ancestors were a larger kind of human who shrank over time, then their story is a reminder that evolution has no fixed direction, no steady climb toward bigger brains and taller bodies and us. Put a population in a strange enough place, with strange enough pressures, and humanity can bend into shapes we would never expect. Smaller, stranger, something that, if we met it, we might not even recognize as kin. For most of history, we imagined ourselves as the inevitable peak of a long, straight climb. The hobbits whisper a different and more humbling truth, that we are just one twig that happened to survive. On a tree that branched in directions we are only beginning to map. On islands and in valleys we have barely begun to dig. When did the last hobbit die? And did our ancestors ever meet them, walking the same beaches beneath the same stars? Number 5. The footprints that broke the timeline. For most of the last century, the story of how humans reached the Americas seemed settled. The first people, we said, walked across a land bridge from Asia near the end of the Ice Age and arrived around 13,000 years ago, no earlier. That date was almost sacred. Then, in the gypsum sands of White Sands, New Mexico, researchers found footprints, human footprints, preserved in ancient mud, the tracks of adults and children who had walked across the shore of a long-vanished lake. And when they dated the layers above and below the prints, the numbers came back staggering. The footprints were between 21 and 23,000 years old. That is nearly 10,000 years earlier than humans were supposed to be there at all. These people were walking across North America at the absolute height of the last ice age, when colossal glaciers were thought to have sealed the continent shut. So how did they get there so early, past walls of ice that should have blocked the way? Did they come by boat, paddling down the coast thousands of years before anyone imagined? The footprints do not lie. Somebody was there. Real people, a mother carrying a child, crossing that ground 20,000 years ago. Day. For decades, the official story had a name. It was called Clovis First, after a site in New Mexico, where distinctive stone spear points were found, and for years it was almost dangerous to a scientist's career to suggest that anyone had reached the Americas before the Clovis people. Evidence that hinted at earlier arrivals was dismissed, ignored, or explained away. But the cracks kept widening. Ancient sites turned up, scattered across both North and South America, with dates that simply should not have been possible. And then came the White Sands footprints, which were almost impossible to argue with, because they were not tools that could have shifted in the soil or bones that could have been contaminated. They were the actual physical impressions of human feet, frozen in time, layered between datable seeds, in undeniable sequence. Whoever left them was simply there, walking, living, 20,000 years ago. The discovery quietly shattered a century of certainty. It means the peopling of the Americas is once again a wide-open question, and the first Americans become more mysterious, not less, the more we learn. They came earlier than we thought, by a route we cannot confirm, and then they vanish from the record for thousands of years. And if they truly arrived that early, it forces us to rethink how they came at all. The classic picture has people walking south through a narrow, ice-free corridor that only opened up much later. But at 20,000 years ago, that path was very likely sealed shut by walls of ice. So how did the White Sands people get below the glaciers? The most likely answer is the sea. They may have traveled down the Pacific coast by boat, hopping from shore to shore, living off the rich life of the kelp forests and tides, leaving little trace because their campsites now lie drowned beneath a higher ocean. If so, then the first Americans were not trudging hunters crossing a frozen plain. They were mariners, navigators, explorers pushing into an entire empty hemisphere. It would make their journey one of the boldest in the human story, and almost nothing of it survives. Real people, a mother and a child crossing a muddy lakeshore, left their steps for us to find. And almost everything else about them, who they were, where they came from, and what happened to them, is a complete blank. Number 4. The day the sky turned to ash. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano named Toba did not simply erupt. It detonated. It was one of the largest eruptions in millions of years, blasting thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the sky, far beyond anything in recorded human history. Ash rained down across thousands of miles, and some scientists believe it may have plunged the world into a brutal volcanic winter, with the sun dimmed and the climate thrown into chaos for years. Here is where it touches us. When geneticists study the DNA of living humans, they find something strange. We are genetically, shockingly similar to one another, far more alike than our numbers should allow. It is as if, at some point in the deep past, the entire human population crashed down to a tiny number, perhaps just a few thousand individuals, and everyone alive today descends from those few survivors. Some researchers have linked this near extinction, this genetic bottleneck, to the catastrophe at Toba. Picture it. Our entire species, reduced to a handful of scattered, struggling bands, clinging to life under an ash-darkened sky. The last embers of humanity nearly snuffed out. The theory is fiercely debated and may not be true. But the bottleneck in our genes is real. At some point, we very nearly did not make it. What makes Toba so haunting is how it links a distant geological event to the most intimate thing imaginable: the survival of our own family. Volcanic winters are not gentle things. A few years without a proper summer can collapse the plants, then the animals that eat the plants, then the people who eat the animals. For a species like ours, spread thin and living hand to mouth, a decade of failed seasons could be a death sentence across whole regions. If the bottleneck is real, then there was a moment, tens of thousands of years ago, when the entire future of humanity, every city that would ever be built, every song that would ever be sung, every person who would ever live, hung on the survival of a few scattered, frightened bands of people. Not nations, not tribes. A few thousand individuals, total on the whole planet. Some scientists push back hard on the Toba link, pointing out that tools have been found buried right above the ash in some places, suggesting at least some people carried on without much trouble. The argument is far from settled. But strip away the volcano, and the genetic puzzle still stands. Our DNA carries the unmistakable mark of a population that was once shockingly small. At some point, against the odds, we were nearly erased. And whatever the truth about Toba, the larger lesson is humbling. We like to imagine our species as a triumphant, unstoppable force, marching from the caves to the stars. But the deep past tells a more fragile story. For most of our existence, we were a rare and vulnerable animal, never numerous, always one harsh winter or one erupting mountain away from oblivion. The same planet that cradled us has also, again and again, come close to shrugging us off. Ice ages, droughts, supervolcanoes, plagues, we will never know the names of. We are here not because we were guaranteed to be, but because each time, just enough of us survive to begin again. Every person alive is descended from an unbroken chain of survivors, stretching back through every one of those near misses. And we still are not certain what brought us that close to the end. Number 3. The Great Awakening. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors looked almost exactly like us. Same bodies, same brains, as far as we can tell from their skulls. Anatomically, they were modern humans. And yet, for an astonishingly long time, they did almost nothing that we would call human. Their tools barely changed across thousands of generations. There was little art, little ornament, no sign of the restless, symbol-making mind we carry today. And then, somewhere around 50 to 70,000 years ago, something changed. Suddenly, in the archaeological record, it all explodes into life. Cave paintings, jewelry dotting burials with grave goods, complex tools made of many parts, musical instruments carved from bone. Wide, traded across long distances. The full glittering machinery of the human mind seems to switch on, almost all at once. Scientists call it behavioral modernity, or the Great Leap Forward, and the mystery is simple to ask and impossible to answer. Why then? If our ancestors already had brains like ours for ages, what flipped the switch? Was it a tiny genetic mutation that rewired the brain for language and imagination? Was it a slow buildup that finally reached a tipping point? Or did the spark already exist for ages, waiting until something, maybe language itself, finally set it free? The gap is what unnerves people. Our species, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, has been around for roughly 300,000 years. But the great flowering of art and symbol and complex culture only really takes off in the last 50 to 70,000. That means there may have been 250,000 years during which creatures with bodies and brains just like ours lived, and yet left behind almost nothing to suggest the rich inner life we take for granted. 250,000 years of near silence, and then, suddenly, fireworks. It is as if humanity sat in a dark room for an unimaginably long time, fully capable of turning on the light, and only at the very end reached out and found the switch. Some scientists argue the leap was not really sudden at all, that the evidence was simply lost to time, or built up so gradually that it only looks like an explosion from a distance. Others insist something genuinely changed, that a true threshold was crossed. Maybe it was language reaching full power. Maybe it was a change in the brain too subtle to show up in a fossil skull. Maybe it was simply that populations grew dense enough for ideas to spread and survive instead of dying out. And this is not just a question for scientists in a lab. It is a question about what we are. If the spark of the modern mind could lie dormant for 200,000 years before catching fire, then everything we are most proud of, our art, our science, our cities, our gods, was not inevitable. It was latent, waiting, contingent on some trigger we cannot name. It means the difference between a clever animal and a world-changing civilization might come down to something astonishingly small and fragile. A new way of speaking. A new way of teaching the young. A single shift in how one mind could touch another. We carry that same spark right now, in every skull. The Great Awakening is the reason you can understand this sentence. Picture a mammoth you have never seen, and wonder about people who died 40,000 years ago. Whatever it was, it is the moment the lights came on inside the human mind. And we have no idea what struck the match. Number 2. The first word. D-A-Sal. Of all the things our ancestors ever did, This may be the most important, and it left no trace at all. Language does not fossilize. A spoken word vanishes the instant it is made. There is no ancient tool we can dig up, no painting we can point to, no bone that captures the moment a human first opened their mouth and made a sound that meant something to another mind. And so the single most powerful invention in our history is also one of the most invisible. We do not know when it happened. Estimates range wildly, from less than 100,000 years ago to well over 1,000,000. We do not know how it happened, whether it came in a sudden burst or crawled forward across 1,000,000 years of grunts and gestures, slowly gaining meaning. We do not even know for certain whether other kinds of humans, like the Neanderthals, could truly speak as we do. What we do know is what language did. It let one mind pour its contents into another. It let knowledge outlive the knower. It let a band of humans plan, remember, teach, and dream together, as a single connected intelligence. Every other mystery on this list, the temples, the symbols, the art, the Great Awakening, almost certainly depended on it. Scientists have hunted for clues anywhere they might hide. They study the shape of ancient throats and the tiny bones of the inner ear, trying to guess what sounds our ancestors could make and hear. They examine the holes in fossil skulls, where the nerves that control the tongue once passed, looking for hints of fine vocal control. They even search the genome for genes tied to speech, and find that some of them are shared with the Neanderthals, hinting that our vanished cousins may have had voices of their own. But every one of these clues is indirect, a shadow on the wall rather than the thing itself. None of it can tell us what the first words were, or when a sound first carried a shared meaning between two minds. And the stakes of this mystery could not be higher, because language is not just one human ability among many. It is arguably the one that makes all the others possible. It is how a discovery in one mind becomes the property of all minds. It is how the dead teach the living. It is how a few thousand survivors of some ancient catastrophe could rebuild, remember, and eventually fill the earth. And there is a strange beauty in the fact that this, of all things, is the great silence. Language is what lets us record everything else. It is the tool we are using right now, you and I, to reach across whatever distance separates us. Every fact in this video, every discovery, every theory, traveled to you on a river of words. And yet, the origin of that river, the first trickle of meaning passing between two ancient minds, is the one thing words can never describe, because there was no one yet who could write it down. We can speak about almost anything. We simply cannot speak about the birth of speech. It happened in firelit nights, and whispered warnings and shared glances that left no fossil and no echo. The most transformative event in the history of our species passed in total silence, and then erased the very silence it broke. Language is the invisible foundation beneath all of human history, and the story of how we came to speak is written nowhere, in nothing, and may be lost to us forever. Number 1. Why are we the only ones left? Here is the strangest fact of all, and we live with it without ever thinking about it. There is only one kind of human on Earth. Just us. This feels normal, but in the long story of our planet, it is bizarre. For almost all of human history, the world was full of other kinds of people. There were the Neanderthals, strong and clever, masters of Ice Age Europe. There were the Denisovans, spread across Asia. There were the tiny hobbits of Flores. There were others still, whose names we are only beginning to learn. For hundreds of thousands of years, our planet was home to many different human species at the same time, walking the same valleys, crossing the same rivers, sometimes meeting, sometimes mating, sometimes perhaps fighting. And then, one by one, every single one of them vanished, until only we remained. So the final question, the deepest one, is simply this: why us? Were we smarter or just luckier? Did we outthink them? outtalk them, outbreed them? Did we carry diseases that wiped them out? Or did we simply absorb them into ourselves until their bloodlines dissolved into our own? Or did we destroy them in the world's first and longest war, a conflict so old it has no name and no memory? We do not know. To really feel how strange our loneliness is, you have to stretch your sense of time. For more than 99% of the human story, we had company. Imagine standing on a ridge 100,000 years ago and looking down into the next valley and knowing that the people there were not quite your kind. They walked upright like you, made fire like you, buried their dead, and raised their children. And yet they were a different sort of human altogether. That was the normal state of the world for an almost unthinkable length of time. Many human species sharing one planet. Our recent past, where we are utterly alone, is the strange exception, not the rule. And the way the others disappeared is its own dark puzzle. It did not happen all at once, like a single battle. It happened slowly, over tens of thousands of years, species by species fading out, until the silence was complete. Some of them did not vanish entirely. We carry pieces of them inside us, Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA woven into our own, which means that on some level, they did not only die. Part of them became us. Perhaps that is the closest thing to an answer we will ever have. That we are not just the survivors of our lost relatives. We are, in part, made of them. And maybe that is the thread that ties all 10 of these mysteries together. The buried temple, the silent signs, the little statues, the ghost species, the tiny people, the early footprints, the near extinction, the sudden awakening, the first word, and the empty branches of our family tree. Every one of them is a place where the human story goes dark, where the evidence runs out and the questions begin. We tend to think of prehistory as something safely behind us, solved and settled, printed in the textbooks. But the truth is that the deepest chapters of our own origin are still missing. We do not fully know where we came from, how we became what we are, or why we, of all the humankinds that ever lived, are the ones who remain. We are a species with a kind of amnesia, piecing together our own childhood from a few scattered bones and stones and shadows on cave walls. We are the last species of human being, the sole heirs of a vast and crowded family that has otherwise completely disappeared. And we are left alone with the most unsettling thought of all, that the reason we are here asking these questions might be that we were the ones who outlasted everyone else. Those are 10 prehistoric mysteries that science still cannot explain. 10 silences from the deep past, still waiting for an answer. Which one keeps you up at night? Tell us below. And if you want to keep exploring the mysteries of where we came from, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.